Are you and your church intentional about how you're making a difference in the world? Are you being strategic about how you're involved in missions? On this episode, we're going to talk about the key components of a mission strategy and about how to create and communicate that strategy. Welcome to this episode of the Global Missions Podcast.
Welcome to the Global Missions Podcast, a podcast for Christ followers who want to participate more effectively in God's work both at home and to the ends of the earth. Visit us at globalmissionspodcast.com to find show notes, resources, and previous episodes. Here's your host, Rob Magwood, better known to his friends as Mags.
Hi again, everyone. We are glad you've joined us as we continue to discover how to participate in global missions more effectively. I'm your host, Mags, and I'm really looking forward to today's interview with Ellen Livingood, the founder and director of Catalyst Services. The topic is Missions Strategies for Local Churches. Just before we get to the interview, we'd like to share with you this missions resource.
How will you ring in the new year? You could be at Urbana, worshiping and learning with 16,000 people who desire to learn about God's work in the world and how they can be a part of His kingdom work. Urbana is hosted in St. Louis, Missouri from December 27th to 31st. Visit urbana.org to register today. And now, here's our interview with today's expert guest.
Hello again, everyone. I am pleased to welcome you to today's expert interview. Our guest is Ellen Livingood, and for those of you that haven't had a chance to meet Ellen, she is the founder and director of Catalyst Services. It's an organization that provides resources and consulting and training to both mission agencies, organizations, and to local churches. She has a background in communications and mission administration and partnership development, and for 13 years, she was the director of global outreach at Grace Point Church in Newton, Pennsylvania. Her passion is to strategically engage the church's untapped potential with today's amazing global opportunities. Ellen, welcome to the program.
Thanks so much. I'm really excited about this opportunity to share with you and your audience today, and it's a privilege to be able to help churches in the area of strategy. So this is exciting.
Yeah, glad to have you. Just before we get into the topic, the main topic, would you please give us a brief history of who you are and how you came to be passionate about these things?
I had the privilege of growing up in a home where missions was important, and so have had an interest and a passion for missions for a long time. But about 20 years ago now, began to see just a tremendous tidal wave of new opportunities in the global setting, of opportunities to work with the global church as it was exploding, and to see that there was so many new opportunities with technology and travel for people to get involved in missions. And so that's what is exciting to me. I think if the Apostle Paul were living today, he would just be incredibly excited about these kinds of new opportunities and what we have available to us in the Great Commission. But it also means that we have responsibility for how we steward those opportunities. And so I think as we look at that, my passion and my challenge is to help churches to steward all that God's given them really well. And as you said, we're excited about the untapped potential in the church and want to see more of that utilized for the kingdom and for the spread of the gospel.
Well, it's a great segue into our main topic, which is creating a mission strategy for a local church. So just as we begin, explain to us what you see as a mission strategy and why is it important for a church to have a strategy?
Nowadays, we talk a lot about mission strategy, but sometimes I like to use both the term priorities and strategies, just to make it a little bit clearer. Priorities to me are the big vision pieces. What is God calling your church to do? What kind of a major impact has He prepared and gifted and resourced your church? And as you step out in obedience, what are you trusting God to accomplish? Then strategies are the second half of that, sort of the flip side of the coin, and that's the way that you get there.
So the priorities are the big picture, and the strategic elements are kind of the wheels to get the big picture moving.
Yeah, and they're very complementary, obviously, but I think that it's important to look at that. Maybe you could call it a 30,000-foot view. What is it that we believe God's called us to? And when we know that, we can begin to talk about the strategy of getting there.
Right, the how. Can you give us an example of where you've seen this at work?
Yeah, one of the churches that I think is a great example of priority and strategy is College Church in Illinois. They, a number of years ago, looked at the global needs and opportunities and were moved by the fact that over 2 billion people, we roughly say 1/3 of the world's population, have no opportunity to hear the gospel. And they said, clearly for us, that unreached 1/3 is our number one priority. So that was their first priority. Then in terms of how they were their strategy for that, they began to say, we're going to identify the places that have the greatest unreached populations, and our strategy is to send people to those locations. So first priority was that unreached 1/3. The strategy was sending people there. Their second priority was leadership training. They looked at the fact that, as they say, about 85% of the pastors and church leaders in the developing world have no formal training in theology or ministry leadership. And then they looked at their church and they said, wow, we've got a lot of people in this congregation. God's given us people who have a background of training and even teaching theology. We believe that God's calling us to bring that together. So their second priority was global leadership. And the way they did that, they said, we want to be partners. They chose a number of seminaries around the world, and they said, we are going to partner with these seminaries, coming alongside of them, seeing how we can work together. So that was their strategy. And then actually have a third strategy as well, which I like, is that they want to powerfully mobilize their people. And they spell out some measurable goals in that direction. They talk about, we want to have 50% of our adult members participate on a short-term missions trip. We want 25% of our people on care teams. We want 10% of our church going out as missionaries. So maybe that's a good illustration of priorities backed up by strategy.
Mm-hmm. And some very practical measures as well by which to evaluate whether we've accomplished what we believe God is leading us to do.
Right, and that measurable, the metrics part of it. Not everything is easy to measure when we're looking at missions, and we don't want to do just head counts. But metrics and measurements are really important, I think, because we don't know if we're succeeding, if we're using the right strategy, unless we have some ways to measure that.
Yeah. So does every single church need to have priorities and strategies? And if so, why?
Well, I think that in essence, every church does have priorities and strategies, but sometimes we don't know what they are. I mean, we don't recognize them because many times they've been defined by other people or they've been purely reactive. Let me just explain that a little bit. Churches that are denominational for many years, for decades, have really allowed their denomination to take over the missions leadership. They basically delegate all of that to a denomination and maybe just write a check, do some praying, that kind of thing. Or churches involved in faith missions really have left priorities and strategies to individuals, and individuals will come to them and say, I feel called to this. This is my vision. Will you support me? And so those kinds of churches have ended up basically just being a collection of other people's priorities and strategies. And that's worked in many ways up until recently. But in the past decade or so, we have had a significant number of churches that have looked at that model and said it's inadequate. And there's really three reasons for that. One is that they look at scripture and they say passages like Acts 13, 1-3 specifically illustrate how God uses the local church in the sending process. And they've realized that they have delegated away to others the responsibility that God's given to the church. They've also recognized that congregations today, especially younger people, aren't excited just by a long list of missionary names or lights on the board or pins on the map. Whatever we do. That's just not motivational. People want hands-on. They want to know. They want to get involved in the narrative of what's happening. And then churches are also asking some very important questions about what are we accomplishing. Churches are looking at a lot of money and a lot of effort and a lot of time invested in missions and saying, we want to make sure that it's really done well. So those kinds of things have pushed us to be more proactive about what we're doing in priorities and strategies.
Yeah. It sounds to me like all of these are based on a good intention to accomplish God's purposes. There's a bit of refining that's taken place. Many churches that I've interacted with in Canada are, I would say, generally dissatisfied, or they have a measure of dissatisfaction as to how they are doing global missions now, or missions locally. I'm hoping this discussion might be helpful to them, and moving beyond that dissatisfaction to having some concrete, well, in this case, priorities and strategies that would help them get traction on that.
Yeah, I like that term. In fact, I often will say to a church that, if they want to change missions, I hope they have a holy dissatisfaction, because making changes, doing things in new ways, thinking about priorities and strategies can be complicated, and it can get messy. Yeah. So if we're satisfied with where we are, maybe there's not the impetus to change. But I'm excited too, because I find a lot of churches that really do believe they can do a lot more. They really are dissatisfied when they look around and they see God's invested so much in them and they're not using all of it. So that's the exciting part.
Yeah. Well, let's proceed from the understanding this is going to be helpful to a church to have priorities and strategies. Who should be involved in the creation of a church's priorities and mission strategy?
I'm really glad you asked that question, because I think that comes back again to one of the reasons why we haven't had a coordinated engagement of the whole church in missions. And that's because missions advocates have looked at the pastor many times, or maybe the elders or leadership staff, etc., and said, we aren't, the church isn't engaged in missions because you aren't excited about it. Here's the program. Why don't you just get on board with this and wave our flag? And quite honestly,
we know how that goes.
Yeah, pastors have got everybody wants them to wave their flag, and everybody has a plan for their life, and everybody, has something else. And particularly when it's coming in from the outside, that's just, it is just really feels like you're being railroaded, like it doesn't connect with their heart or grow organically out of where they're seeing God take them as a church and as leaders, what their passion and what their vision is. And so I think it's just really important when they're thinking about priorities and strategies that any church says, we want to bring our leaders into this process from the very beginning so that it reflects what they believe God's calling this church to, and that it integrates in with the whole picture as they see it as leaders. That doesn't mean the pastor's going to implement things. That's not his job. But it does mean that the pastor has the opportunity to speak into it, and then I think it really increases the ownership in that process.
Excellent advice. Excellent wisdom for those that are interested in missions and perhaps consider themselves to be passionate about it, how to invite key leaders, pastors included, into the process, depending on which side of the border you're on.
I've got to learn to translate here.
It's all good.
Yeah. There's one other thing I would say to that too. Then obviously the missions leadership, whatever that's a team or a committee, is a part of this. But also then I would encourage churches as they're looking at moving into this process to make sure they've got all ages or all adult ages represented. Sometimes leaders tend to represent older generations. There may be people in their 50s, 60s, 70s, but there's nobody in their 20s and 30s and 40s, or not a strong representation. So I would just encourage, because you want to hear from people who represent those groups, but then you also want people who've been a part of the process who can then take it out and share it and communicate it well. So that's just another aspect of that, who's involved process.
Well, just a quick reminder to those who are listening to this episode of the podcast that we are taking show notes as we talk with Ellen, and you can find all of this summarized on the website. So don't worry if you're driving or riding your bike. We're writing down all these points, and you can get them and download them from the website, globalmissionspodcast.com. Ellen, obviously there are going to be elements, various components to having priorities and strategies. Talk to us just a little bit. What are some of the main pieces that need to be considered?
One of the initial questions that's important to think about is, how are you going to define missions? If this is a mission strategy or a global mission strategy for your church, what does that include and what does it not include? It used to be that missions was just anything that you did that you had to buy an airplane ticket to get there. But nowadays the world has come to us, and some of the most unreached peoples in the world are represented by communities very near us. Mm-hmm. And so that's something we have to wrestle with. Are we going to say that missions is cross-cultural? Sometimes for me that's a definition that has some usefulness in it. But however you define your terms, and I think it is important to define terms, I think we need to go back to that Acts 1:8 challenge. Jesus' last words to us was to be his witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, the ends of the earth. And however you want to define that, it's obvious that Jesus clearly was teaching us that we needed to have a focus on everything from here, our back door, as it were, to the very ends of the earth. Very good. So we have to incorporate, all of that in the mix.
Mm-hmm. We sometimes say across the street or around the world. The mission is the same. Proclaim and live the truth in Jesus' name. Steve Green sang that, actually. And defining that will be so important for a church. What do we mean by missions? It's good.
I think one of the challenges, too, with that is that, yes, we need to do it, like you say, at home and around the world, but we also need to recognize that those ends of the earth, around the world piece is usually the hardest. And I have many churches that will say to me, wow, we used to have a lot of people that were at the ends of the earth. And, they came home from the field. It was tough. They had health issues, or maybe they got moved up in administration and now they're in Canada, in an office position, or, now they're working in some other kind of a role. And we don't have anybody, or we don't have many people who are in that ends of the earth, the unreached. So I think that, again, however we look at strategy, we need to remember that we need to keep pushing toward those ends of the earth, and that may take more proactivity than some of the other aspects. So just to keep that in mind.
Very good. Well, once priorities and strategies have been identified, and this, I would just add here, is a big part of the material that you have prepared at Catalyst to help a church identify their priorities and their strategies. Just say a little bit about the material, if you would, that you have prepared for that purpose.
Yeah, there's several things that we have available in connection with this podcast, and also some things that you can order on our website. And the website is just catalystservices.org. There's two postings that help to outline this. The first is called 5 Steps Toward Global Engagement, and it's just a couple pages that help to lay out where to start. And as we've been talking about today, I think it's important that you start with your priorities and strategies. The last of those steps is the organizing part, but many times people want to get their policies. They've been thinking about policies. How do we organize things. That's important, but if you don't have the big pieces in first, I think we can get tied up on the details and forget that we haven't looked at the big pieces. So that's just a short article that outlines those kinds of things. We also have another piece that talks about some of the hows, what's your mission strategy, talks about some of the comparative ways that we look at strategy. So those are both there. And then we also have a manual available on the website that's called Your Focus on the World, that actually is a book that walks people through the process, walks the church through the process of thinking about what's our strategic initiative going to be. Again, that looking at what are the priorities and how do we work that out. And there are trained facilitators to help a church through that process. We have a number of people in Canada, all across the country, who are prepared to help your church if you want some face-to-face help with that.
Mm-hmm. I would just mention here the mission that I serve with, Send Canada, has a number of those trainers too, and we would be delighted to be helpful to churches as they think through this. We've had Ellen's training, and it's excellent material. The articles that she has mentioned we will include with the show notes, so if you'd like that simple download to get a summary of what Ellen's been talking about, you can find it there. Ellen, I just want to ask you about communication. A certain group of people will meet together and prayerfully put together these ideas, priorities, and strategies, but just talk to us a bit about communicating that strategy once it's been established to the congregation so that everybody has a sense of ownership.
That's such an important question. I was just working with a church a week or so ago that was saying, oh, we haven't had a strategy. And then the people who had been there for a while said, oh, yes, we did. And it's like, but I guess the congregation never knew what it was. That's a tragedy. I mean, the whole point is that you have something that people can own and understand and get excited about. First of all, I think is the articulation of it. I encourage churches to start out with to finish with a one-sentence statement of strategy that's catchy, that everybody in the church can remember. Then you need a one-page description that's got some visuals to it. We always remember things that are in a picture, some kind of a graphic format that's easy to remember. And then you probably need maybe a 3 or 4 page document that spells out more of the background, maybe some scriptural background, some more of that strategy that helps, your leaders, your missions leaders, but also your pastor and your elders, other kinds of leaders to understand, yes, this is what we've said. And that also gives you continuity. One of the challenges is that, we're transient, and leaders change and missions team changes. And we need some of that paper can help us in that articulation. But one of the exciting things I think about communicating is that most of our churches have people that are sitting there week after week who are professionals in communication. And so often we don't use them in missions. I'm thinking about people in marketing and social media and writing and video and sales, PR, whatever, those kinds of skills that you can bring in and say to them, hey, will you help us? And I think so many times people are willing to be used. They've just not been asked, particularly if you can use their professional expertise. Bring them along and say, here's where we feel God's calling our church, but we need your help in order to understand how to communicate that. So making it memorable, making it short, repeat. It's like right. Location with real estate. And then just, involve people that have a passion for that and know how to do that, particularly with modern types of communications.
Mm-hmm. Great ideas. And I would just say, too, that should a church leadership team, missions committee work through this focus material from Ellen's organization, Catalyst Services, there's going to be a natural alignment between the capacity of the church at this time and the vision. Ellen, sometimes I've been in churches and the church has a sense of history. Well, we'd like our missions program to be like it was 20 years ago. We really did missions well then. And they're looking back. Or they're looking forward and saying, well, in 10 years, we'd like it to look like this. And that may or may not be actually attainable, realistic. It's great to have the vision. But I think a strength of this material is helping a church discern right where they're at now, discerning God's call and the resources He's entrusted to them, and building that together. So there's going to be a natural affinity, I hope, for the congregation to understand and to engage.
And that's what gets people excited. I mean, they want to know, what can I do now? And is this going to contribute to something that's going to be more exciting in the future? So you do need vision. You do. I mean, it's fine to talk about what you're trusting God to do down the pike. But if it's just vague and it's just out there somewhere, then it's hard for people to wrap their head around that or get very excited about it.
Well, if people would like to learn more about all of this, Ellen, we've just scratched the surface. Where will you direct them? You've mentioned the website. You can do that again. What will they find there, and what would be helpful to them?
We would be happy to interact with you in various ways. If you go to our website, catalystservices.org, you'll find how to contact us. You can just write us at info@catalystservices.org. We'll be glad to respond to you and set up a Skype call or a phone call or whatever would work for you. On our website, there are over 100 issues of our e-zine called Postings. They address all kinds of issues that local churches are facing as they lead missions with their congregation. So there's all kinds of resources that are there for free. You can sign up for postings and you'll get every month, as well as announcements of other kind of training or opportunities or resources that are there. So we are happy to be of service in any way we can to local churches.
And I would just affirm my interaction with Ellen over the years now. Ellen has shown how generous and flexible Ellen is to take the principles that she's learned and to see them helpfully applied in a whole bunch of different contexts. And we've appreciated that so much, I know, at Send, Ellen. And as we partner together with you, we thank you and we thank the Lord for how these things are useful to local churches.
One of our basic values is to avoid, reproducing the wheel, as we say. Let's learn from each other and share. If you can take something that we've done and maybe customize it for your setting, that's thrilling for us because we think that's a great use of kingdom resources that way. So that's our goal, to be helpful and useful. And, we're happy to help any size church. We don't put a high price tag. In fact, we don't put a price tag on things. We really want to serve churches and to make that available in any way we can.
Excellent. Well, Ellen, thank you so much for taking this time this afternoon just to describe some of these things. We've just barely got into it feels like to me, but there are a number of resources here that individuals or churches will be able to explore further. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the opportunity, and we just encourage churches to get in there and start talking about what God is calling you and how He's resourced you, and I think it'll be a really stimulating time, exciting time to look at how God wants to use your particular local congregation.
We hope you found today's interview to be both informative and inspiring. If you missed anything or would like to check out the resources or links mentioned during the interview, you can find the show notes we've prepared at our website, globalmissionspodcast.com. You can also use the website or our Facebook page to suggest a particular topic or expert you'd like to hear featured on this program. The Global Missions Podcast is co-sponsored by the Jaffrey Centre for Global Initiatives and Send International of Canada. Thanks for listening in. I'm your host, Mags, and I invite you to join us again in 2 weeks when we'll continue to explore this grand adventure of being Christ's witnesses to the ends of the earth.